So what we did with this project was we talked to Erin and she said, I need to get more downforce on my planter. And I don't mean to pick on her here, but I did look her straight down and say, how are you getting that? She said, I set a 55 pound bag of seed on the row unit. I was like, that ain't gonna cut it, okay? So what we did is we threw the kitchen sink in our planter tractor setup. So auto steer, we have hydraulic downforce, and I have a toolbar full of steel, so I have a 5,000 pound 4-row planter, which is ridiculous. But long story short, I've never run out of downforce. We have depth control. We have some super cool seed firmers that I will tell you about at some point. We're using depth control on not only our row unit, but also on our closing wheel system that is automatically changed. And then we also have various types of closing wheels. So with all of that, keep that in mind while Dr. Drury talks to you. I'm going to introduce her. She's been was a postdoc with me, now she's a faculty associate. I'm hoping she ends up being actual faculty because she's a rock star, but we'll get to that in a little while. But anyway, I'll let her talk to you. I'll be here to fill in any questions when we go out to the field. Ask away. We'll point and click and tell you what's going on, okay?
So essentially we had two main questions we were trying to answer. Can we improve planting by either changing how we're setting up our planter, or can we improve it by changing how we're terminating that cover crop? So I've kind of got two different storylines I'm going to tell. So as Brian was saying, we were looking at how can we set up that planter. We were looking at things like, do coulters make a difference? So we looked at the difference between having no coulter and having, we just picked a 13-fluted wavy coulter. And then we also looked at closing wheels. So that standard rubber closing wheel versus an aftermarket closing wheel. And we just picked one, which was a spike type closing wheel. There are, of course, many, many types of closing wheels, but kind of what we've seen in some other conventional research is that maybe they're kind of all doing pretty similar things, so we weren't as concerned about type, right? There's the spike type ones, there's the paddle type, the curve times. They're all basically doing the same thing. You're getting maybe a little bit of tillage out of that closing wheel, which is going to help maybe especially in corn, kind of get a little bit of that tillage, more mushy soil. You're also hopefully doing a better job at closing that furrow, which when you have a cover crop is a lot more difficult, as I'm sure you guys have all experienced. And then the final thing we wanted to look at is down pressure. So does down pressure affect our stand and yield? So we did these trials in both corn and soybeans. I'll have a little more to talk about soybeans because corn has been a lot more experimentation. I can tell you a lot of things that don't work in corn. Whereas soybeans, there's a few more things that do work. So what we've seen with soybeans the last couple of years as far as setting up our planter is really nothing. I have nothing to tell you. So essentially what we've seen is we have not found significant differences between our treatments. And so that could mean a few things. It could mean that planter setup doesn't really matter. It could just mean, as we all know, there's a lot of variability in the system, and 2 years isn't long enough to tell us that planter setup matters. Or a third one is essentially, with our small 4-row planter, we're just doing a really good job at it, so even our kind of worst treatments aren't as bad. So we're still waiting for more data on the soybeans. Corn is a slightly different story when we're looking at planter setup. So we don't have a ton of data because we've been trying a bunch of different things, some of them successful, some of them not. We've had more success planting corn into rye and vetch, which is what I have on your handout. We've also tried some medium red and crimson clover, but haven't had as much success, so I'm not confident really talking about what we have. So what we've seen with, again, just 1 year of data, which I don't like to make recommendations off of 1 year, but what we're maybe starting to see is that one thing for planter setup is this interaction between coulters and closing wheels. And so if you have standard closing wheels on your planter and you add a coulter, we saw a small bump in yield. If you had aftermarket wheels, that coulter didn't matter. And so that was the only one thing we saw is, again, if you've got those standard like rubber wheels, you can see possibly some improvement by adding that coulter. If you've already made the investment and have your aftermarket wheels, we didn't see a difference when adding that coulter. So hopefully that's one thing. We're hoping to have a lot more to tell you. You'll see some somewhat optimistic corn going on out there. And then, so that was the first question we were trying to answer, right, is what can we do on that planter? And beans, not so much. Corn, maybe we see an effect of coulter, depending on what type of closing wheels we have. And the second question we were trying to answer is, how do we terminate that cover crop? And so we looked at two main methods. We can either use a roller crimper or we can mow it. So we looked at two different crimpers. Honestly, we haven't seen much difference between those two types of crimpers. But the one difference we were looking at is mowing versus crimping. So our thought process was that if you already have a mower, and instead of investing in a crimper, if you already have a mower, that could be one way to terminate that cover crop. And so we've been using a civil bar mower to mow down that rye or rye vetch in the case of corn versus using that crimper. And so what we've seen is not much, which I guess is good. So it doesn't really matter too much, at least in our experiments, how you terminate that rye. You can mow it, you can crimp it. Statistically, there's no difference in yield and weeds between those two treatments. I will say mowing probably takes a little more finesse. So you do, if that cover crop isn't laid down perfectly, you can have spaces where weeds can come in. But if you do mow and get a nice lay down of that cover crop, it seems to be just as effective as crimping. So those are kind of the big takeaways. And I guess I can talk a little more about the corn as we get out there, but I think really, which I think is probably what most of you are more interested in, is the corn. And we're trying the medium row clover and the rye and vetch, and we're seeing some promising things about both of them, but I can talk a little more in the field about sort of the details between those. So maybe you have any? Oh, that's true. I forgot about the most exciting thing in soybeans. Yeah, so the last thing we looked at in soybeans was seeding rate. And so we picked 225,000 seeds per acre and 185,000 seeds per acre. And the great thing about that is we did not see yield differences between those two seeding rates. So we were able to get enough seed in the ground and have, we had a higher stand with the higher seeding rate, but yield was the same. And so I guess.
Were those both 30-inch rows?
Those were all in 30-inch rows. Yep.
And then between the mower and the crimper,
Yep.
does the mower allow you to terminate any earlier than the crimper, or does it still have to wait till a while?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question was, like, does the mower let us terminate any sooner? So I really want to know that. That is a question I would love to answer. For this treatment, we kept the termination date the same, just to keep it on equal footing. But I think that brings up a great point. I think we came up with a lot more questions doing these experiments than we came up with answers. So that's something we really want to look into, is can we push that termination date up sooner?
There's so many interactions. Another thing with the mowing, and just to give a 60-second overview of the organic no-till system. So we're planting a cereal grain in the fall, in mid-September. So just some of the key points. You need to get that rye in early, mid-September. You need to plant it. This is a debate that Margaret and I are having. Margaret always comes up with the best questions. Because we did some work with planting earlier. We typically are recommending about 3 bushel an acre, which is a real rough estimate because depending on rye variety, the seed size is different. So I think it's 3 million seeds per acre that we're recommending. A lot of the biomass comes from tillering though, and that's why we're planting early, is because we need the tillering. So depending on the fall, we can have different degrees of tillering. So that's where it's like, well, can we dial back the rye seeding rate? Well, it depends on the fall. We can't really predict the fall. But you need to get the rye, if you want to reduce your risk and have this like have the best chance of working, plant that rye early, design a rotation where you can plant that rye early, plant it at 3 million seeds per acre, and then plant your soybeans at anthesis, which is right around June 4th here in Wisconsin. People are starting to plant at the boot stage. It can work. It's riskier though. It's riskier for getting stands, and it's riskier for regrowth. And if that rye keeps growing and doesn't completely terminate, you're going to have potential rye contamination for subsequent crops. So if you absolutely want to reduce your risk and have like the best setup for the system to work, Plant the rye in mid-September, heavier seeding rate, wait till June to plant it. But to go back to the mowing question, one thing we learned quickly, but this is also true for roller crimping. I think it is really interesting to note that there's more models of roller crimpers, and so far for us, they seem to be all doing a really good job. But if you're mowing, plant first. Don't mow and then try to plant into that residue. No matter how good your planter is, it's going to be a pain in the neck, and it's going to be hard to get the seed in the ground. And I do want to stress that I really think you guys just have an awesome planter, and that's why you're not seeing a difference. Because we are starting to do some variety trials in this system. I think too, if we can look at getting better varieties of corn and soybean adapted to the system, that's going to have it work better. And our corn breeder went out with her planter, and she said it felt like she was like using a toy. So we had to like have Brian save us to actually make like slots in the rye, and then to just get that darn corn seed in the ground. So the planter does make a difference, but these guys have an awesome planter. So planting first and then mowing, but that's where it goes into like really this is a whole system, because we need standable rye. So that if we have that rye lodging, it's hard to mow because it's still on the ground, and how are we going to mow it? So we need to get the good varieties of rye that are adapted to the system, look at how we're going to terminate it. Even if you're roller crimping, it is possible to, it's a 2-pass operation, and I know that's not necessarily ideal, but you can plant into the standing rye and then go over and crimp it the same day if you're nervous about your planter getting that seed into the ground. That's another option as well. And then I wouldn't crimp first and then try to plant in a 2-pass operation, because then you don't have your, unless maybe if you're on RTK. It's just hard to tell where you're planted if you don't have any sort of guidance system. So that's kind of like that's more than 60 seconds, but that's kind of the overview.
You're spot on. The other thing we learned too is if you're gonna crimp first, if you do that, plant the same direction you crimp always. You can ask Ben and Megan over there what they think of planting against the grain. But they didn't enjoy me. I'm BAT, I don't get out of tractor, so they're the ones that have to clear all the mess off. But yeah, anyway, long story short, we did nothing gee whiz about the planter, okay? There's no engineering magic there. It's all available stuff that you can get. A lot of it is that you need enough weight on the planter to get the units in the ground, and make sure you have sufficient downforce to get the units in the ground. And the other thing too is, and I'll plug this because it works. It's not that I'm a fan necessarily, but that seed firmer. So Dawn Equipment makes a seed firmer that's a wheel instead of those Keaton, am I correct on Keaton, that drag the seed along and make a mess. I don't know how many people use those with cover crops, but they don't seem to work very well. But that wheel that's rolling in the furrow and pushing the seed straight down, I actually have to get a pry bar to get the seed out. You talk about seed to soil contact, it does it in spades. So that may be one of the reasons, regardless of where we put that seed, we're putting it in moisture and we're putting it in where it's touching soil on all sides, may be one of the reasons we're getting such good stands. But anyway, long story short, I don't know if there's any quick questions here while everybody can hear well, otherwise we'll move out to the field. Yes, sir.
Was there any real difference in moisture, tension at least, between mowing and crimping? Did you find they were holding more moisture?
Yep, I'll repeat the question and let Jesse answer. So the question is, if we mowed versus roll crimp, was there moisture retention differences as far as the rye absorbing moisture or other things?
So we didn't measure that. It's also it's a little hard to measure in the system because we're doing like small plot trials. So the mowed treatments are right next to the crimp treatments, and so it's a little difficult they're so close spatially, right? But there is some that could happen, right? Potentially in a really dry year, if you're mowing that cover crop, you're going to stop the growth right away. And versus crimping it, there still can be some growth.
Jessica's spot on that. We did measure that about 10 years ago, and what she's describing is exactly what happens, is that even though the crimping is bending it, it's supposed to be stopping or at least slowing the transpiration, what we see is that when we roll it, you still see that rye is green, and it will still continue to physiologically do its processes and pull out some water. So if you mow it, you're just cutting it right off. So we did do soil moisture measurements, and it did that mowing was less on the soil moisture profile. This is the first year, besides 2012, that I was just ready for the worst year ever with what we were planting into. Most years it's so wet, I'm happy that there's some moisture being sucked out. But in years like this year, mowing actually may be a better practice.
So it's nice to have that flexibility, right? And maybe in a wet year, it isn't as critical the decisions you make, but in drier years, mowing could be another tool in your toolbox. And we've only used sickle bar type mowers, so we haven't done any other type of mowing. We have a small 10-foot sickle bar that we use. So it does a nice job of just laying that rye down. It doesn't work quite as well on the vetch and rye. That vetch gets a little, makes a lot of things a little tricky, but that's a great question. Does anyone?
I'm getting a rotary for the veg next year. Don't put a sickle bar in live stuff. Don't do it.
So the question is when we're mowing, are we getting drier regrowth? Not substantially. There really isn't much. I'm not going to say there's zero, but it has not been a big issue for us. And again, that could just be location, it could be seasonal. I can't say that wouldn't happen everywhere, but we've not had. Yeah, so the question is when are we mowing? So yeah, we're mowing at basis when we crimp, because we've been doing everything at the same time. So there is some question like, could we play with the dates a little bit? And that is a question we would really love to answer is could mowing let us adjust the dates some and still have a relatively lower risk system?
And is it a better practice for a system with food grade cereal grains in the system because you're getting less regrowth?
Is there a fuel cost difference between mowing and
So the question is there like fuel cost implications and all? We did not look into that. I don't know if Brian's got some.
I will go 100% speculate. So we do it one pass, roller-crimped and plant all at one time. Tractor's running about 1,500 RPM, something like that. Where the mower will run the PTO speeds going through there after we plant. So mowing typically is a 2-pass for us. If you had a front mower running the plant on the back, and tractor had no hydraulic, you could do it one pass. So speculating, I would say mowing is a little bit more fuel usage the way we do it. That said, if you get it to one pass and get your planter with, same as your mower with, you can run it all at the same time, which I'm thinking, 10, 15 foot planter maybe. Yeah, you can make that balance out pretty easy.